that sacred tradition of art is the foundation of all art, and that has thousands of years of precedence in human culture.
You're listening to the Octave Leap podcast, a coherent vision for the future of business. Welcome back to the Octave Leap podcast. I've been migrating locations over the last few episodes, as you guys have probably seen, and now I'm sitting in a art temple / magician tower with an incredible visionary artist named Jake Kobrin. Jake, it's so lovely to have you here on the show today. How you doing, man?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Jake, I'm surrounded by his art pieces right now, and they are slowly elevating my consciousness. That's all I can say. I can kind of feel everything just go. That's super cool, man. Did you how did you come to make visionary art as opposed to just like regular art?
Well, I was exposed to visionary art when I was pretty young because one of my dad's best friends was a printmaker and worked with Robert Venosa, who's an incredible visionary artist in like the 1980s or 90s. And so he had these amazing paintings by Robert Venosa in his house. So when I was really little, I used to go over to that house and just kind of stare at them for hours and be like lost in them. So I think that was my first exposure to visionary art. And then I got into the work of Alex Grey through the band Tool. And I guess that I was really inspired by Alex's book as well, The Mission of Art. And when I started getting into things like meditation and psychedelics, it just seemed like a more meaningful way to use my talents as an artist to try to create positive change in the world in some way and to reinforce a spiritual connection both for myself in the process of making art and for the viewer. Mm-hmm. Whereas I was actually going to art school for illustration and just kind of on a commercial track. And I saw where that led because I knew a lot of people in that industry and they were all kind of depressed and introverted and malignant. So,
yeah,
being exposed to this sort of alternate path of art as a path of light and upliftment and as a vehicle for enlightenment, mm-hmm. as well as Alex Grey, who in his book kind of connects the process of making art to all these sacred wisdom traditions throughout history.
Yeah,
that was really meaningful for me.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said about commercial art, because I see that being like one's creativity is essentially sequestered into a very narrow bandwidth of what like a company needs, mm-hmm. right? And so that can often feel stifling and leading to those states of being like depression. But what you're talking about is actually like, how can art make you expand further? How can it like stretch your capacity for what you think is possible in a way?
Right. And what Alex Grey acknowledges is that sacred tradition of art is the foundation of all art, and that has thousands of years of precedence in human culture. Mm-hmm. And art as more of a commercial endeavor is very recent, 100 years or 200 years. So that is art essentially to humans, and human culture is an expression of the sacred, an expression of the divine. It's sort of a religious or spiritual byproduct in a certain kind of way. And generally, if you look at art history, even of Western culture, art also always is connected to religious and spiritual traditions. Absolutely.
It's interesting having traveled the world and seen the intricacy of art in various cultures. Like, if you go to Peru, you go like into like the jungle and stuff, you just see the vibrant colors that came from obviously a psychedelic culture there. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting that they tend to go hand in hand. Or in India, where there was a real mecca of consciousness essentially, you see how that reflects in the art. And of course, we live in Bali together, so you see even in the Balinese culture, when they have these devoted religious and spiritual practices, it reflects in this, I don't even know how to describe it, this exquisiteness, this elaborateness, this portrayal of our multidimensional existence. Mm-hmm. And it's wild. It's like, and then we kind of come back to our society and we see like, oh yeah, it's like a cute cartoon character on a coffee cup type of thing.
Yeah, but I mean, within Western culture, there's also the great cathedrals and all these. Also, it's also part of, Western art history is like absolutely incredible and sort of my my primary inspiration, although I love also Eastern art traditions.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at all these different world cultures and wisdom traditions, the one thing that unifies all of them, whether you're talking about Islam or Christianity or Buddhism or, Hinduism or the animistic cultures in Bali, it's sacred art.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that it seems like a natural outpouring of the mystical experience, that when people have these kinds of spiritual or mystical experiences, there's a desire to create art because they're inspired,
Right.
and that's something that exists all throughout the world. It's fundamental to what it is to be human.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Western culture, since that's sort of your background. But I've done a lot of research into medieval history and even before that. And, you had like the stonemasons of the Middle Ages. And in many ways, there's a lot of communication between ancient cultures coming out of the Middle East and Egypt, where they were encoding that with sacred geometry, essentially. Not only that, but they were building cathedrals that in the span of a lifetime may never be realized. Some of these cathedrals took hundreds of years to build. So it's like they're working with an inspiration that they know is going to have to be perpetuated past their own mortal existence, which, I mean, there's something to be said for that in a way. And I think the big thing that I'm seeing is, or wanting to get at, is that now there's this push to kind of create art fast for a very specific function or outcome, which, like you say, is branding or corporate art or something like that. But it kind of reflects in the culture too, that, people's creativity a lot of the time seems to be locked up. I know a few people who are creative consultants or creative coaches, and they're working with people that are, it's a big thing. People are like, I know I'm creative somewhere in here, but I can't seem to access it. And it kind of, I think, reflects out in the culture because, you don't really see that so much living in Bali. It's like if people are going to be creative, they have outlets for that. But we've sort of lost that sacredness as a culture, and it still remains in certain pockets. But do you see that as being correlated as well? Is that something that you recognize too?
Yeah, sure. I think that all creativity comes out of that sacred place. It's all creativity in essence arises from a place outside of the mind. And so as our culture has become desacralized and more, taken farther away from connection with our true source and essence, due to many reasons, that has also stifled people's creativity. And regardless of what any person's perspectives may be on religion, the greatest works of art in human history and the greatest achievements, it seems, the highest achievements of humanity have always been done in the name of the sacred and in an expression of that divine inspiration. And so I think that a lot of the things that afflict our culture in the West in terms of anxiety and depression, it correlates heavily also to the decrease of inspiration and the decrease of creativity. And the solutions for those are similar. They're both about reconciling our egoic nature with the true nature of ourselves and discovering that which is much deeper and fundamental to our existence. And through penetrating into the sacred dimensions of life, there's this natural outpouring of inspiration and creativity. I think that's why there was a kind of creative revolution in the 1960s when the use of psychedelics and things like this was so prevalent. It's because people were just rediscovering the sacred. They were rediscovering that natural outpouring of inspiration that's intrinsic to our being by deconditioning the egoic mind. And so you had naturally all of this creativity that also was being infused into the culture.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one question that comes to mind is, what is needed then? Is it like people need to reconnect with the sacred first before that sort of creative outpouring happens? Or is there sort of an access point by going through the creativity?
Well, to draw or to paint or to create anything, to create a work of art, is to access the sacred. Understanding that everything that is created in this world isn't created by us, but through us. And so through creating anything, you're opening yourself up to be a conduit of divine creative energy, a vehicle, a tool, an instrument of the divine to produce whatever wants to be born into this world. So for me, art is a spiritual path. creativity is a spiritual path, whether you're a musician or a dancer or a painter or photographer, whatever it is. Just by being in that creative current and opening yourself up to inspiration to allow what wants to be realized into this world to come through you, and painting is a profound meditation, dancing is a profound meditation. And for me, these are spiritual practices.
Yeah. Have you helped people that are like, maybe like they work in a corporate environment and like they haven't had the opportunity to access their creativity in the past, but that you've seen them find that? Has that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Can you describe what that process is kind of like? It'd be just interesting to hear about.
Yeah, I've worked with a lot of people like this. And the process that I use is kind of a process of learning to get out of your own way and to allow whatever wants to come through you without attachment. Because the truth is, when you open up to creative spirit or whatever you want to call it, the inspiration that comes through us, you're not always going to like exactly what comes through you. And you don't really have as much control over what comes through you as you'd think. So people that are really mind dominated, kind of really left brain, try to control everything. But there's kind of this delicate balance when it comes to the creative process where you need to let go of control enough to allow what wants to come through while also sort of guiding it. It's kind of like, water bending or something like that. And so a big part of the process is I have people start journaling every single day and just write without any censorship whatsoever of what comes through. And that gets people into the habit mode of being able to create without that inner censor coming up and stopping people. Because if you just sit down to create and you have a practice around it where, I'm going to draw for an hour every day, eventually things are going to come through. And even if it takes months, in those months of doing that every single day, you're going to get somewhere. You're going to start to produce something. But it's really only in that process of, oh my God, this looks like shit. I'm not a real artist. People are going to laugh at me for doing this. I can never show this to anybody. Miss Mullins was right. I'll never make it, whatever it is. And then they stop themselves. That's the inner censor. That's the inner critic that blocks people's creativity. So really it's about creating a new relationship with the inner voice. And so it's kind of a mindfulness or meditation process. And I find using the tool of automatic writing to be really useful for that.
Yeah. It's funny because I know a lot of people in the spiritual community that use automatic writing as well. But, I think if you make it a practice as part of your creativity, there's an element more of commitment to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's sort of like it's blossoming into something else at the same time. It reminds me too of Leonard Cohen and the way that he would write song lyrics. Are you familiar with that?
No.
That's exactly what he'd do. He'd basically open a book and he'd just start writing. And he'd say that like sometimes he'd get one line of lyrics in about 10 or 20 pages of automatic writing. But he would just open himself up to that and just let it come out and then review it afterwards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Leonard Cohen was a pretty deeply spiritual guy. I mean, he spent the last number of years in a Zen monastery as a Zen monk.
Yeah. While you're talking to, I was kind of smirking to myself because you're a metalhead too, or you listen to metal just like I do. And it reminds me of Michael Ackerfeld from Opeth. Mm-hmm. It's like he's the most like kind of funny, kind of dorky guy. And then like you hear the creativity that comes out of him and it's just like, it's huge. Mm-hmm. That sound that comes out of him, out of his guitar and out of his vocals, like it's wild, but you would have never suspected that from the guy and his personality and his demeanor and the way that he tells jokes. Mm-hmm. So it's like, you almost can't peg a person and what they're going to create.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you want to use like Opeth as an example, I think that he's probably been surprised at the direction that his music has taken. And it's a good example of somebody who's following a creative current and being guided by that rather than him necessarily trying to impose his own will onto the creative process. If I were to guess what's happening, I would imagine that it's been a process of like experimentation and weird discovery into, strange and unexpected avenues of music rather than him trying to like, create an idea that he can force the music to sound like, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it was interesting too in that journey because I followed him and what he was talking about. They ended up going more in the direction of increasingly analog and organic, like more just off the floor takes as a band. using more analog tube gear as opposed to digital processing. The one thing they just couldn't give up was using like Pro Tools instead of analog tape, which for obvious reasons. I mean, I think that was the biggest revolution when, the recording industry switched from analog tape into sort of a digital DAW. But he said that was the one thing that they couldn't give up. But everything else, that sort of journey of experimentation led him into this real vibey, organic direction, which is interesting because you don't know where it's going to go when you're starting out, right?
Yeah. I painted a portrait of Michael Oberfeld and gave it to him at one of their shows. And supposedly, like I ran into their tour manager that used to work with them like some years ago. And they were like, they still have that painting in their studio.
Oh, no way.
So I got a painting in Neopeth's studio.
I wonder how much fan art these artists receive. And, that's an interesting concept, right? It's just like,
she actually contacted me recently and was like, I met you, 10 years ago at that Opeth show. I don't know if you remember, but I followed your work and I'm managing this other band right now and they're looking for an album cover.
Oh, no way.
And I was like, what? That's crazy. Like when I was 16, I gave him that painting and, so you never know, like when you do these little things, like where it's going to end up or like the kind of karma that can come from it.
Totally. Have you managed to get do many album covers essentially?
I used to do a lot of album covers. Yeah. Mostly in the metal scene, but also for other like electronic music also.
Yeah, I could see this really being, by the way, if you're listening to the recording, I'm surrounded by Jake's incredible art right now. If you're watching on YouTube, you see about, I don't know, maybe like a tenth of it, but it's literally surrounding his room right now. And it's wild. It's the variety, the colors. It's like you really tap into quite a wide bandwidth of creativity. Some people kind of have their mode and their set and they just kind of stick with that. But you seem to have this real diverse spectrum in which your art expresses itself.
Yeah, I don't know if it's I get bored with things and I want to try something new, or it's just like I just want to do new things. Like I want to, like for me, I'm like addicted to the process of like learning new things.
Yeah.
That kind of journey from start into becoming something and like realizing a skill. So yeah, and there's a lot of things I want to do, but I guess primarily painting that's been the main medium for me throughout my life, drawing and painting.
Yeah. And with that, like, what are you feeling when you're creating these? Like, what kind of state of being are you in? Is it similar for each painting, or does it vary quite widely?
Yeah, for me, it's like a meditation, and ideally, in a good painting session, I'm very quiet and empty, and in a very still place of just like focused, relaxed concentration, and that's really why I paint. It's like the reward of making art is intrinsic to making art. Whatever other kind of external validation or attention or recognition or money or any of those other kinds of things that I might receive are pretty small in comparison to the state of consciousness that I'm in when I get to make art. So that's why I do it. Really, it's just because it's like a meditation. It's a deep way to connect with creative source and to be in a place of transcendent stillness.
Right. But I mean, with that too, you have received some recognition. I mean, your art's sold in galleries and to private investors as well, which is probably an accomplishment on its own. Correct me if I'm wrong, but like being able to sell your art, being able to have that income support you in some capacity allows you to spend more time doing that than having to go out and, a lot of people are, hobby artists because they have to earn a livelihood somewhere else. But it sounds like you have a rich, diverse net of skills that allow you to basically do this more often.
Yeah. I mean, that's pretty much the game that most real artists play, which is just like, how do I create some kind of a, how can I create income from my art so I can keep making art? Because most artists that are, real artists, I mean, that's to distinguish from people that are just kind of like playing the art game to try to make money or something, which there are artists out there that are doing that. But people that really make art for the sake of making art, it's usually just, how do I make art all the time? How can I sustain myself so that I can draw and paint as much as possible, be in that creative flow as much as possible? And it's hard. it's hard for every artist I know to do that, you know, and the amount of things that take you away from that creative flow, unfortunately, is numerous. But
yeah, I mean, if your state of being is connected with your income, that really kind of makes you live life with sort of a different precedent to it, right?
yeah, I mean, and there are things that I really need to do that might seem counterproductive. Like sometimes I need to, you know, go into silence for like weeks on end and not be what seems like traditionally productive in any ways, but these kinds of explorations and rootedness and connection into different aspects of myself, my soul, my spirit are where the art comes from. It's like when I'm empty and I'm like drained and I'm exhausted and constantly needing to rush around and do a million things, and like I can't make art when I'm in that sort of turbulent whirlwind kind of place. It's like I got to go back to a place of being clear and centered, and only from there can I make art.
Mm-hmm. So that sounds like a very rich space to be in, like when you're clear, centered, calm.
Yeah, you literally don't need anything else, and I think that's what every single person in the entire world is looking for, and unfortunately taking themselves farther and farther away from that in what they're seeking. It's like running in the wrong direction. But yeah, I think we're all just looking to feel content within our own self and to be able to feel at home within our own being.
Yeah. I mean, it's the only reason more people probably don't do it is because the education that they receive is wrong. You know, just to seek more things out, to basically, you know, you're bombarded with advertising all the time that's basically trying to tell you that there's something wrong with you and you need to fix it with a solution that's provided for you.
Yeah, and the people that make those advertisements are also ignorant to what creates actual happiness. You know, so it's like the whole culture is based on fundamental ignorance in terms of what produces any kind of feeling of satisfaction. And so that's the whole machine is just discordantly tuned to the wrong. It's the compass is broken, you know?
Yeah. Do you feel like a creative renaissance could sort of right the direction of the ship?
I believe that really art is probably the most impactful thing when it comes to people's consciousness. Mm-hmm. And when I say art, I'm not talking about just paintings. I'm talking about movies. I'm talking about graphic novels, stories, TV series, you know, media, even, like media that people create on social media. So yeah, I think that art is really the most effective way to change people's consciousness. And I think that there are enough artists who have realized some degree of awakening and had certain kinds of, fundamental remembrances through various types of experiences, that they're imbuing that into the work that they create with the intention, the kind of altruistic intention of impacting the world in a positive way, because our world is a nightmare and people need to wake up from the nightmare as quickly as possible, you know, and it's always been a nightmare for all of human history. And this is a perennial issue that has never really changed. So there's always been people that have been capable of realizing certain levels of peace and tranquility and awakening within their life. And some of them have been artists, and some of them have communicated those experiences through their art. And that, you know, that's been the case for thousands of years.
Yeah. It's interesting. One of my mentors he was an artist himself, and he did a lot of jazz art for like Herbie Hancock and a few other jazz musicians. I'm not too sure who they were exactly. Some of his art ended up in the White House, even like it was abstract art. But he was also a science fiction writer. It kind of reminds me sort of the way that you work, in that you do work with so many different things: music, art, writing, you know, poetry, all sorts of stuff. And anyway, what he said though about science fiction is that like when you kind of empty yourself and you start to like envision the future of things, you're actually more likely to hit what the future is going to look like than scientists who project linearly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can see so many examples of science fiction writers that did a bit, like were really, they hit the mark in terms of where things are headed and future technologies and things like that. And, you know, a lot, I'm a big like Philip K. Dick fan and stuff. And like, there's a lot of like dystopian sci-fi predictions that unfortunately also seem to be coming true. But
Yeah. I mean, like, when did he write like A Scanner Darkly? Like,
I think it was the 70s,
yeah.
right?
And Ubik, that's another one. So that's like, you know, that's based on like, I think it's the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
Really?
Yeah. In a very sort of like abstract way. But yeah,
He was a crazy Gnostic, like
yeah.
madman mystic.
Yeah. Who else am I thinking of? There's another. He wrote the Illuminatus trilogy.
Oh, Robert Anton Wilson.
There we go.
I'm a huge fan of him. Yeah.
So yeah, my mentor was friends with both those guys.
Cool.
See, like, he's an older guy, so he was friends with them. So that's what he was talking about, specifically that type of science fiction. And he would tell everyone, you got to read these books.
Yeah.
Like, those are the books to read.
Both of them used a lot of drugs.
Real fucking high.
They were real fucking high when they wrote their stuff.
Well, I mean, you got to tap into something, right? What's the muse for it, right? I mean, stillness sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, like, you know, these epic Buddhist Thangka paintings and stuff, they're realized from profound stillness and emptiness with people that spend years in silence and meditation. So that is a pretty enduring way to access the muse. But there is a relationship between chaos and disorder and emotional volatility and madness and creativity as well. And a lot of artists also seem to be inspired by that and create from that sort of dynamism. So
I think in Hinduism, they talk about the left-handed path versus the right-handed, right? Most people are better off on the right-handed path because it's like the solar path. It's just like you commit, you do your thing, you empty out, and you find God. The left-handed path is that other one you're describing, living in the smashan grounds and, you know, meditating on corpses and putting all sorts of things into your body, right? It's sort of a maddening process. You're always walking right at the edge of the mouth of madness, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have certainly walked that path.
No doubt. What are some of the things you've tried, if you care to share them?
Everything. I mean, I was like a serious Thelemite and did like hours and hours of, you know, Aleister Crowley magical rituals like every day, and like totally blew my mind on that stuff, and had a lot of weird experiences and explored into the depth of the occult and ceremonial magic, and also gone on like, you know, deep solitude journeys into prolonged meditation and self-mortification and hook suspension and fasting and celibacy and you know, the opposite of celibacy and just everything in excess. And I'm just very experimental, you know, like I like to find things that are interesting and unexplored and just want to see what it's about, like on the other side, you know, and then also like, you know, tons of psychedelic experiences and forays into really profoundly altered states of consciousness.
Has the needle of experimentation, has that found sort of at least a narrower thing? Like you'd experiment with fewer things now, or do you still think everything's on the table?
I mean, I feel just more content in general. I mean, I'm in a place in my life right now where I feel really content with whatever, like with fewer preferences and really just trying to, rather than fill myself up with accumulating more experiences, really just try to eradicate the desire program in general. So yeah, like, I mean, for me, I'm just happy now to just be kind of like sitting in silence. And that's mostly what I want to be doing, is I just want to be meditating. I want to be drawing. I want to be painting, you know, and even it's like people like, oh, let's throw this party and like, let's do this and let's do that. And it's like, oh, like, it's all so exhausting, you know? And I think that when you realize how exhausting it all is, like everybody's just like running on these treadmills going nowhere and just like exhausted, and it doesn't fill you up really. And it's like, you know, I want to be full.
Yeah. It's this whole series of short-term dopamine spikes, right?
Exactly. So yeah, dopamine is kind of like the enemy in a lot of ways. It's true, you know? And so I think it's like learning to reduce the addiction that we have to dopamine in a certain sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's healthy forms of dopamine and unhealthy. Like, I mean, sunlight triggers our dopamine. Ice baths trigger our dopamine.
Sure.
And if you do those, you're less inclined to reach for maybe the negative forms of dopamine hits, which could be scrolling on social media, alcohol, pornography, like these things that like are rampant in our society because people form these addictions to them and they're kind of socially acceptable. But people know that they drain them over time, right? And each of these can lead to, like alcohol can lead to just excessive ragers. Scrolling on social media can just turn into like having to stay connected with a billion people on a very superficial level for long periods of time versus getting the simple things that nature provides us, essentially. Unless I'm missing something, unless sitting in a polished room, dark room in silence is like the way. I've never done that for a prolonged period of time. I'd be curious, but for me, it is, I always find that I'm more happy and more nourished in the elemental forces.
Could be the way.
Could be. There's always this element
there
of
have been some pretty like compelling arguments made by sophisticated and highly realized and intelligent beings that have made pretty good arguments that it could just be the way to just not need to do anything.
So if we all had our temperature controlled dark pod, sat in there, that would be fucking cool, actually.
Well, it's kind of like this thing where, you know, people say like, well, why would you join a monastery when there's so much like suffering in the world? You need to be out there and helping things. But it's like, what creates the suffering? The suffering of the world is created through meddling with the world, of like everybody trying to do things that have unintended consequences that create suffering for both themselves and everyone. So it's just like to stop karma, you know, to ultimately cease action in the world, to just be okay with just stopping, like, you know, just be, just, it's okay. Like sit, you know?
I mean, I think I would agree that like the times that I've spent in more solitude, in quietness, there've usually come at pivotal moments where I've changed the direction of my life quite drastically. So I can agree that everybody out there probably needs slowdown periods. What would you say that would be something that could remain? I mean, that's the thing, is like if I see if people stayed in like a super like austere sort of lifestyle where they were really inward the whole time, like we wouldn't really be creating anything.
Yeah, but then there's also these traditions of Buddhist monks that spend years in silence and meditation and create these profoundly beautiful paintings that take hundreds of hours to create. You know, and same with even Michelangelo was essentially a monk. Like he wasn't, but he lived like one.
Yeah.
You know, he was very austere in the way that he lived, and very pious in the way that he lived, and he created profound works of art. So I think that creativity is intrinsic to human nature. And I think that what comes through the creative channel when it's clear, through purifying your mind and purifying your being, essentially, it's going to be, you're going to bring through something pure also.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, do you think though that's a path for everyone, or do you think it's just like there's a certain inclination or type towards that? Because they always, you know, especially in Eastern religions, they always talk about the city or the monk versus the householder.
I think if it's your ultimate goal to reduce suffering on the planet as much as possible, then it should be the path for everyone. It's possible for it to be the path for everyone if each person is able to have a taste or experience of that being profoundly more satisfactory than what little pleasure or satisfaction people seem to gain in the world.
Yeah.
The habit and the energy, the sort of momentum behind the desire and fear that fuels attachment to the world and the doing in the world is so intense, though, that it takes a lot of work and effort to change that. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if everybody is necessarily yet at the place in their incarnation to make that great effort that's necessary to change that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think people, the whole world and every being on it will eventually reach a place where they've like suffered enough and want to put an end to it.
Mm-hmm.
And start to seek really the way to do that and discover it, which, yeah, I think it's the most cliche thing ever, but can really only be found within ourselves.
It always comes back to that with, a rich explanation, but essentially all paths lead to the same place, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's funny because I work with a lot of people who are heart-led, or, they want to evolve on a conscious trajectory. And essentially it's funny because whenever they talk about what they do, it all ends up in the same place. It's like, be that pure essence of yourself, or, go within yourself to find that and to basically express that in the world.
Mm-hmm.
But the way that appeals to different people is different, right? So naturally, the path that we choose to get there can vary quite a bit. Like in your experience, it could go from trying out everything in excesses, or it could just be more of that purity path of just basically distilling everything into nothingness. I think I'm a little bit between both of them, to be honest. I kind of like trying things out in the world. There's a dynamism to that. But who knows? I mean, just talking to you is also shifting my perspective on the matter, because I know you recently did a Vipassana meditation.
Mm-hmm.
And, how did you feel about that, especially referencing the backdrop of culture and busyness and all these things going into that space? What was it like in there and then afterwards?
I'm much happier in that space than I am in the outside world, quote unquote. Like I could see myself becoming a Buddhist monk at some point or something like that. Like, it's so much better, it's so much more still and peaceful. And there's so much more nourishment and saturation of our being and our senses to actually be able to be rooted in our experience in such a balanced and wholesome way compared to how most people live in the world. So I'm like addicted to that state of consciousness. And so, it's like I would do, if I had like satisfied all contracts in the world, like I would probably just either do Vipassanas all the time or like become a monk or something like that. Because for me, there's like absolutely nothing else that even really compares to that, like even sex and orgasms or psychedelic drugs. Like, I just smoked 5-MeO DMT and it's like, great. There's nothing compared to like what you can experience in deep meditation. Like that's just, it's so much more pure. It's so much more still and balanced and grounded and complete and stable and wholesome. So yeah, like, I mean, people find Vipassana retreats to be very extreme. It's not, for one thing, like you're doing it for 10 days, whereas there are monks that do it for 20 years or more. And it can be very challenging for people who feel a lot of restlessness and a lot of disquiet within themselves. So you're experiencing with the impurities of your mind, you're experiencing the pains and impurities of your body. And so in that's a lot of discomfort. But if you sit through that and you're kind of disciplined around it and you get to the other side of it, there's just, very profound peace on the other side.
Yeah, it's sort of a temporary experience, right? It's like, I've done a lot of work with brainwave entrainment, and physiologically there's what I call the chronic buffer between 9 and 11 hertz in your dominant brainwave frequency. So just below the beta range. So as people start to relax, there's this crust of distraction, restlessness, anxiety. They hit that, and then they tend to get catapulted back off of that into a higher frequency of brain activity, versus the actual process that you're talking about with meditation of drilling through that. And that's not really a comfortable place, especially if somebody doesn't have guidance in their meditation, or if there's no inner knowing that eventually, this doesn't stay like this forever, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, meditation is an exercise designed to do only one thing, which is to decondition the habit tendencies of the mind that are averse to experiences. So like when you experience pain and you go, I don't want to feel that, or cling to experience. If something good happens to you and you go, yes, more of that. And that's it. That's all meditation does. So as you're sitting in meditation and stillness, pain comes up. Wow, like there's pain. My leg really hurts right now. I'm just going to watch that. Right now, my leg does not hurt. The fact that my leg hurt when I was meditating a week ago, it's gone now. It's a temporary experience. There's no reason to have such a strong reaction to something that is totally temporary and totally empty. And so you realize that in life, just the same, like, wow, this person's in love with me. Like, great. That's temporary change. I'm not going to like have to bottle that up and try to savor it. It's like, it's temporary, or, oh God, this terrible thing is happening. Like, it's temporary. We've all experienced thousands of pleasant and unpleasant things throughout our life, and they're all temporary and changing. There's no reason to either grasp onto or push away from any of them, because they're like bubbles. They're like dreams or phantoms. That's all of our experiences like that.
Yeah. It's funny because, how deeply ingrained we are to seek the things that we find pleasure within, and to, buffer ourselves from the things that cause pain. This is reinforced in our families, in our societies, in sort of the highest echelons of society that a lot of people aspire towards, is like living the good life, right? It's just all caviar and yacht ships and that type of thing.
I mean, if that worked, it'd be great. But I've met miserable billionaires.
Yeah. Well, what's the old expression is basically, poor people want to be rich and rich people want to be happy.
Everyone wants to be happy.
Everyone wants to be happy, but poor people think by getting money that they'll be happy, because then they can do less of the things that they hate.
Yeah. So maybe in that way, like a miserable rich person is closer, because they've already been disillusioned to think that, from the conditioned belief that money will bring them happiness. Maybe they're closer to actually finding it then.
Yeah. Let's talk about happiness, and let's talk about creativity a little bit, and especially ways in which people can start to access that in their own lives. So somebody's listening to this right now and they're like, wow, this is a wild conversation, but like, do I have it in me to access any of this? Like, what would you say to somebody like that?
Yeah, of course you do. I mean, I think that creativity is intrinsic to human nature. It's a survival skill.
Yeah.
We developed like lateral thinking in order to find new solutions to our problems. Like we needed to discover how to make fire so that we could, be warm and make food. That was a creative process. It took lateral thinking to discover that.
Yeah.
And so it's just part of who we are as human beings. We're creative, and it's not just regulated to creative art forms or virtuosic talents or these kinds of things. It's problem solving. That's what creativity is.
And how can people begin to explore the pathways within themselves to unlock that?
Like I said, I think that automatic writing is a good one. It really takes dedication to some kind of creative practice, thinking about it as a practice. I listened to a lecture recently about creativity, and they were talking about Mozart. It's like Mozart is the quintessential creative genius. Actually, what it took for Mozart to become a creative genius was that his father wrote the handbook on violin training, and so basically forced Mozart at the age of 2 or 3 or something to start doing all of this training. And he lived like his father was like a drill sergeant, basically like forcing him to do it. And also his father had a heavy hand in some of his early compositions. So you think of Mozart as just naturally talented. And I think that that's one of the first myths that needs to be pushed away from, is this myth of the kind of lone genius that never did any work to get there and is just naturally and exceptionally talented. It takes work. It takes work for everybody. And the way to get to do that work is through a practice. So if you want to become proficient at an art medium, whether that's drawing or painting or dancing or photography or music or singing or whatever, you have to develop a practice around it. You have to commit to a certain amount of time every day to do that.
Yeah.
You know, and that's part of it. Having mentorship is part of it. Having education is part of it. Being subject to criticism is part of it. Feedback, either from an audience or from somebody that you trust, like a mentor figure. But really, it just comes down to doing it. They say the pop psychology thing is like 10,000 hours to become proficient and master a skill. Creativity requires being proficient and mastering a skill, and then also being able to go beyond what other people have done with that before. So it actually perhaps takes more than 10,000 hours to get to that point. But really, it takes time and dedication to practicing an art form and treating it like a practice, like doing reps in the gym.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think people have that tendency because, you know, children, their neuroplasticity is very malleable, right? They're forming sort of their thoughts and beliefs about things. So if you tell them something, even if you put them in a situation with criticism and that type of thing, they just think that's normal. But when an adult does that, they've had a story attached to it. So there's much more rigidity in the way that they operate. So I think that relaxing is a really important part of it too.
It comes down a lot to mindset. So if somebody has an issue with criticism, it's because they're equating the reception of their work to their value as an artist. Mm-hmm. Whereas having a mindset that is understanding that it's the journey is towards progress, not towards, like, you're not defined by the quality of any work that you create.
Yeah.
Like artists don't all, like even great artists don't always create great works of art. You know, what you see from any great artist, or, you know, what you listen to from any great musician or whatever, it's like, it's a small percentage of what they have worked through to get to that point. So even like, you know, a band comes out with a great album, they probably had to go through so much shit that was unlistenable to get to the place of like, oh, that sounds good. Mm-hmm. You know, and that's just the process for every artist, is having to just sort of slodge through a lot of stuff that doesn't really sound good. The difference is that, or look at the difference is that the artist has trained their ear, their eye, etc., to be able to distinguish what's good and what's not. And that's a process that's really only honed through experience. But yeah, not being so attached to what you create, you know, understanding that what you create is not really created by you. It's a mystery as to where any work of art comes from. It comes through the artist, but it's not necessarily made by the artist. The artist has a hand in it. The artist assists in the realization of that. And for me, this understanding this has really been helpful for me to kind of like let go of so much of a narrative around, oh, I suck because, you know, I don't like this painting or whatever. Yeah. And then also it's just, you never know. Like I've made stuff that I was very proud of that wasn't that well received by my audience. And then I've also made stuff that I didn't like that much. I didn't really think it was that good, but yet for whatever reason, people really love it. You know, there was like one work of art that I made that took me like 4 hours to make. And it kind of was just, it's like this cheesy rainbow wizard guy that was just this, I was like, I think I was high on something and just kind of like made this thing. And it was, you know, it was nothing. And I thought it was just kind of corny and whatever, but like that work of art sustained me for years through like print sales and tapestry sales. Wizard, dude. And I would see it like everywhere, you know, I'd go to like festivals and like people had it all over. And I was like, what the? You know, so, you know, it's not always your most like profound and sophisticated and mature work of art that finds its way into the collective.
It's funny, when I was in a band, you know, we would write these like progressive metal epics that were like 12, 13 minutes long. And, you know, we'd have these symphonic elements. And then we wrote this freaking drinking song. Yeah. You know, it was the Bear Claw Tavern. It was just like 2.5 minutes long. It was like a blazer stayed at like 120 the whole way through. And it was just kind of fun. We went out and filmed a music. It got like Guitar World picked it up and launched it, and it went freaking viral. And then everybody who ever saw us after that was like, oh, you guys wrote this song, like party. And like, no, you know, kind of in a way.
Owner of a Lonely Heart, you know?
Yeah. Yes. Everyone's like, oh, yes, Owner of a Lonely Heart. And I'm like, have you heard the other bass lines? Do you realize the mind-bending music that band has created?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's just that it's almost like I think artists a lot of the time can be ahead of their time, right? Or they're in a realm that isn't ready for mass consumption.
All real artists are outside of time.
Oh God.
Just kidding.
I guess there's some truth to that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, what you're talking about would be outside the time-space continuum, right? It's not
Sure.
sort of this rational thing.
Yeah, it's like there, if you look at a chair, that chair was first realized as an idea, and that idea comes from the ideal, like the kind of like platonic ideal of the chair. And so the process of creating everything, whether it's an iPad or a painting or a metal song, it's like this ingression into time from timeless universal creativity that transcends dimensionality. It's channeling things through from another dimension. That's what all creative people do.
Yeah. So accessing that dimension, marinating in it, and then basically re-entering the time-space continuum.
Yeah.
Yeah. Simple process.
Well, we all do it. Like if you daydream, you're doing it.
Yeah.
If you're thinking about like imagining a conversation with somebody and then you call them and you have the conversation, like you did it. It's the same thing.
Well, it's kind of like I think the only reason people don't is because they haven't addressed their conditioning, right? They haven't addressed that sort of clogging or that buffer that's in the way, which you were talking about earlier. Like the vehicle for you is clearing everything out, going into pure stillness, so that those hooks into and aversions are no longer in the picture.
Yeah, I mean, I also was very creative in some of my more like chaotic, wild times where I was definitely less balanced and more emotionally volatile. So, yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, I get like why.
Yeah, that's
a lot of creatives are bipolar and stuff.
Yeah, but that's sort of like just an uncontrolled crack in the cosmic egg, right?
Yeah.
Because I mean, like schizophrenics, they're living in a different reality or multiple different realities. They're not wrong. They're just not in congruence with the three-dimensional reality that we operate in.
Yeah.
So, I mean, who's to say? I mean, you're right. I mean, one could argue for one or the other. Maybe one over the long term has more sustainability to it because you're not wearing yourself thin. But, I wouldn't know that personally.
Yeah. Creativity is fundamentally a form of deviation, right? So deviants, the people that have, for example, mental illnesses and things like that, sometimes are highly creative. So you have people like, Vincent van Gogh or like Brian Wilson or
Devin
whoever.
Townsend.
Maybe.
You
yeah.
know Devin Townsend?
I met him once. I don't know him.
Yeah, he's got quite an interesting backstory. He was Vancouver based, so everybody in the scene knew him. And like, yeah, his story was pretty wild and the shit he did.
He almost came to this retreat I held last year in Bali, actually.
No way.
Yeah. Or like his record label offered to like suggested him.
Oh, cool.
Because he's friends with Paul Masvidal, who was
of course.
also on my retreat. And so when I was like announcing that Paul was going to be on the retreat, they were like, "Oh, well, what about Devin Townsend also?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure," but I guess he wasn't interested or something.
Yeah, but just another example of somebody who operates in the chaos and then creates this absolute beauty.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder though, because the last number of albums he's made have been like really tranquil, and he's like on this kind of spiritual path now, and I think he's really into meditation and stuff. So maybe he also has found more like stillness in his life.
I think it was always there. It was just being sort of like superimposed by other things. And then, I think we can have both of those elements within us, like a meditative side that really just drops into pure being and that crazy wild side. I've experienced, maybe lesser extremes of that within myself. And I've definitely produced music in both of those states and they kind of get to the same place.
Yeah, I think if there's something this is how I see it. If there's something like an image, a song, an idea that wants to be realized in the world, it's going to find its way into the world for whoever just happens to be kind of like eligible to realize that, my mentor, Android Jones, kind of has this funny idea around like Tinder for muses. Like the muse has like the vision of what it needs to create. And it's got like a Tinder app where it's like looking at all the different artists, and eventually there's like, oh, this person, is like amateur painter, dabbles in Photoshop. And then they're like, oh, this person, like 12 years of classical art training, paints 6 hours every day. You're like, great. You know what I mean? It's like, give them, and like, I so often will have an idea and then I'll see another person do it.
Oh, it's I know.
Crazy.
I know. That's happened to me so many times.
You know, I had a very clear vision of this like sculpture piece I wanted to make when I was on the Vipassana retreat. And then a few days ago, maybe like 4 or 5 days ago, this other artist, it's not exactly how I envisioned it, but it's so similar to my idea. It's like he also got the idea at the same time and he was just faster to do it.
Yeah. I mean, on a societal level, calculus was discovered by Leibniz and Newton at the same time, but they didn't even have communication between them. It was like that notion of mathematics wanted to come into the world to basically shape the Industrial Revolution. And these two mathematicians, one in Germany, one in Britain, basically got the same thing at the same time without any communication.
And if you transcend all the programming that exists in our culture around the ego and around the significance of creative ownership and whose idea is it, and the artist as this kind of exalted pedestaled person, and you see that it's more about just the thing coming into being. And if you can let go of all that programming, then it's like, great. That thing came into being. I didn't have to do it. Somebody else did it. You know, it's a collective effort to realize whatever is wanting to come through into time.
Yeah. Man, this has been a mind-blowing, reality bending conversation, which is awesome. And at the same time, it's like makes perfect sense too. But it's beautiful because it kind of has everything within it. This has been a really enriching conversation on creativity. I feel different in my body after that. I just want to see if there's any way that people could follow you. What's the best way to get in touch with Jake? Do you have anything you can offer people or to know more?
Yeah, well, I mean, I have some existing courses online already on creativity and art. And also I teach magic and ceremonial magic and the kind of Western esoteric and occult traditions. And the best place to find everything that I do, whether it's my painting work or my courses, is probably Instagram. I'm Kobrin on Instagram. And you can find all of my work there. And with David, I'm also working on some new stuff that should be launched soon. So look forward to that.
Yeah. And I will probably update the description once that's ready to feature that. So if you check back in on this interview in a few months, you might see a nice little Easter egg link in the description there. Anyway, Jake, it has been a profound pleasure. And if anybody wants to as well, if they're interested in knowing more about what I do and the people I interview, we've got a newsletter sign up in the description below. You can click that and join our newsletter, which is full of rich insights about conscious business. But aside from that, thank you so much for being on the show. Thank you for your time. Thank you for rearranging your art around the room. It's been definitely setting the ambiance and the mood of something excellent. So thank you, Jake.
Sure, David. It's a pleasure. Thanks, everybody, for listening.